Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. Hussein Abou Bakr Mansour grew up in Egypt. His family was training the boys to become jihadists, to kill Jews. He grew up in that kind of atmosphere where he wanted to kill Jews. And then he ended up being intellectually curious. He found out more about Israel and Jews. He formed relations with Israelis. He was arrested by the Egyptian authorities. He was tortured by the government of Egypt under President Mubarak as being an agent for Israel. And then he got political asylum in the United States. And currently, he's the director of Emet's program for emerging democratic voices in the Middle East. He wrote an autobiography called Minority of One, The Unchaining of the Arab Mind. Hussein, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Zev. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. So let's go back to Egypt. You grew up. Tell us about your family, what it was like. Let's look in context of what happened, and then we'll look at the transformation.
Sure. Just if I'm to make a correction,
Sure.
my family was not training me to be a jihadist. My family was a normal middle class family. The jihadist ideology, unfortunately, was a strong current that existed in the culture all around us, and it depended on a lot of the primary conviction that a lot of mainstream Muslims have, and that's why it's so successful. But my family itself, they were just a normal family. They were trying to just raise the kids and raise them well. My father was an accountant. My mother, like most observant Muslim women, she stayed home to raise the kids and feed them well. And they had convictions that also were just drawn from the general culture. And a lot of those convictions were very anti-Semitic. And anti-Semitism has been an endemic problem in the mainstream culture of many Arab and Muslim societies throughout the last century. And unfortunately, it still continues today. It seems that there is an opening after the Abraham Accords for things to get better. But anyways, that was basically the context, that the culture itself had those or still have strong radicalizing currents.
Because in your biography, you write that your family raised your brother to be an imam, inspiring young people to become jihadists.
He became my family didn't try to make him that, or he just took that path, and it's the path that I wanted to take as well, and it's the path that many young people contemplate taking, at least at some point in their lives. Not everybody ends up taking it, thankfully, but it's unfortunately strong enough that a lot of young people get drawn into it.
So you want to become a jihadist. You wanted to kill Jews. Isn't that what jihadists do? Tell us about why you wanted to be a jihadist, and what did your parents think about what your path was and your brother's path wanted to be?
Yeah. Well, that's jihadists. They target Jews specifically more viciously. They target many other people. But of course, they do have a very special zeal and very deep hatred for Jews. And unfortunately, this part of jihadi ideology, and this is why the problem of Muslim anti-Semitism is a very sensitive problem. A lot of people either conceal it, or a lot of people avoid talking about it, because it's here when the different currents of Muslim culture actually intersect. That is, it's this level of anti-Semitism does not only exist amongst jihadists, who are considered to be the most extreme form of Islam. Very strong anti-Semitism can be also found among people who would be labeled moderate Muslims. And unfortunately, we see that all the time. We see that in kind of almost that blank check support for any form of Palestinian violence that targets Jews, whether it was an IDF soldier or a Jewish family dining in a restaurant. So this level of deep anti-Semitism that, when growing up in Egypt in the 90s, it was truly pervasive, and it existed in every aspect of the culture. It existed in the media, it existed in cartoons, it existed in movies, in comic books. The Jews are evil, the Jews control the world, a lot of conspiracy theories. The Protocols of Zion, for example, is a very popular book. I remember in 2003, if I'm not mistaken, in Egypt, it was turned into a huge TV show that I remembered watching. I was 14 at the time, and I was just enamored and fascinated by it. And of course, the TV show was about that there is a world, a domination conspiracy made and acted upon by Jews. So that existed definitely in the mainstream culture, and that, in my opinion, is actually a gateway to radicalism. It's a gateway to Islamism. It's a gateway to jihadism, and that's the problem of many Muslim societies that refuse to deal with the issue of anti-Semitism. Specifically, they don't understand the destructive role that it plays in their societies in general. So I grew up in that environment, and I really got obsessed with this part. At the beginning of 2000, specifically, things were very inflamed in the Arab media. If you remember the beginning of 2000s, a lot of things were happening at the same time. So you had 9/11. 9/11 happened, and there were a lot of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories around that. Then you had the war in Iraq happening, and then you had the war in Afghanistan. And also, people forget that this was the same time that the Second Intifada was going on. And during the Second Intifada, you had terrorist bombings, suicide bombings every other day. You had constant clashes between the Palestinians and the IDF. And that was also the moment of the rise of Al Jazeera. So Al Jazeera wasn't really well known before that period of time. So those intersecting events created this potent field of radicalization that a lot of young people during that time got radicalized. And I was part of this because I was young and I was impressionable, and I was watching TV all the time. And all of a sudden, this ideological inflation happened that emphasized the anti-Westernism and anti-Semitism above anything else, almost as an anchor of identity.
No, and I hear you, Hussein, but also what I was just trying to ascertain is that not only was it in the media, but I was trying to get a handle from you. Did your parents discourage you from being a jihad? Did they try to discourage your brother, or they let you say do whatever you want to do?
No, I don't think my parents were aware of the ideas that were in the mosques, that we were hearing in the mosques, and things that people were talking about, and just the effects that this had on us. So it's not that that we were going to training camps to become jihadists. We were at that age. I was born in 1989, so at that age I was 13 or 14. I was basically a jihadi wannabe or enthusiast.
No, but I'm saying, but didn't you have conversations at the dinner table? Didn't your brother have? So, in other words, you make it sound like you were in a vacuum, but didn't your parents weren't aware of your ideology? Didn't they talk about, what did they think about you? What did their colleagues think about you?
They shared the anti-Semitism, unfortunately, that the society was basically swimming in. So of course they had these ideas, like everybody else, unfortunately. They didn't think any of them through, but it's just they adopted this. This is just the national culture. This is not something that somebody decides I'm going to become anti-Semitic. No, that's kind of the default generic position.
It's in the air. It's what taught in the mosque,
Yeah.
of course, in the schools, the home.
It is. Yeah.
There's Jews, the Israelis. They don't differentiate between Jews and Israelis. It's the Jews.
They don't, and the entire differentiation that happens in Western culture, of course, is arbitrary when it comes to in a Middle Eastern context. That is, in the Middle East itself, nobody makes this differentiation. Not just nobody makes this differentiation. People often make the point that Jews and Zionists are the same thing, and they make it, of course, in a negative sense. They make it in an aggressive or in an anti-Semitic sense of the word. But they assure that yes, Judaism is Zionism, and Zionism is Judaism.
Now, you're talking about a period of time when President Hosni Mubarak was president of Egypt. wasn't there a peace treaty with Israel? Did that have
Yeah.
any impact beyond just the government to government? Did it have any
No,
impact on the people?
I would say that anti-Semitism got worse in Egypt after the peace accord, specifically starting from the 90s and upward. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And one of them was just there was a wave of religious indoctrination and just radicalization that was going on in Muslim societies in general. But the regime of Hosni Mubarak, while maintained good relations with Israel on a very official and formal level, they maintain the society the way it is in terms of the hostility to actual cultural or social normalization with Israel. And often state media employed just the same kind of anti-Semitism and anti-obsessions with Israel that they had before the peace accord. So unfortunately, despite the peace treaty, anti-Semitism remained a big anchor of the national culture. Now we can question, and these questions, unfortunately, I think is very unknown because of just the level of transparency in these kind of governments. Was it that the state failed and basically was afraid to challenge society, or did the state push deliberately this and just benefited from it? Is a question that I can't answer.
Because, but what I don't, from what I read, and again, you live there,
Yeah.
even though
Yeah.
there was a peace between government to government, but not only did it not filter down to the masses, but the masses were very anti-Semitic, anti-Israel. And from my vantage point, I don't see the government trying to change the public opinion. Correct me if I'm wrong.
It's no, you're right. It's true, but it's not just the masses. It's also actually the intellectuals. So the intellectual class and the high culture establishments in Egypt were responsible for this. That is, it wasn't basically anti-Semitism in Egypt while I was growing up. It wasn't just the hicks of society who believed this. No, it came from the most prestigious cultural institutions. It came from the most prestigious intellectuals. It came from the most prestigious publications. So all of the elite intellectuals were responsible for this in a very direct way, and often the rhetoric that I would hear in the mosque in terms of anti-Semitism was an Islamized version of what many secular intellectualists would kind of conjure up in terms of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories.
So what you're basically saying is whether one was a Islamic fundamentalist or someone who's steeped into Islam, or even a secular liberal thinker, they all hated Jews.
Yeah, in Egypt, yeah, for sure. In Egypt, I want to also make the the point that, of course, after I left Egypt, I gained also more knowledge, sometimes intimate, sometimes less intimate, of various parts of the other Arab societies, not just Egypt, and other Muslim societies. And I can tell that Egypt is actually one of the worst. For example, Morocco is not nearly as bad as it is in Egypt. So Egypt specifically is a really bad case.
We're sitting with Hussein Abou Mansour, director of Emmett's program for emerging democratic voice in the Middle East, but he grew up in Cairo, wanted to be a jihadist, wanted to kill Jews. Today he's helping Jews, and we'll talk about his conversion, his metamorphosis. He's written an autobiography called Minority One, The Unchaining of the Arab Mind. His articles have appeared in Commentary, Newsweek, The Jewish Journal, Times of Israel, Mosaic Magazine, and he's working right now in a whole different direction. We're going to be right back. Don't go away. Stay tuned. And you're listening to the Talkline Network here on WSNR 620 AM, WJPR 1640 AM, and TalklineNetwork.com, WVIP 93.5 FM, HD2.
You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast, on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. Our guest is Hussein Abou Mansour. He grew up in Egypt, wanted to be a jihadist, wanted to kill Jews, and today he's helping Jews. He's director of Emma's program for emerging democratic voices from the Middle East. His autobiography is called Minority of One, The Unchaining of the Arab Mind, and you can find it in Times of Israel and jns.org and commentary and other publications as well. So let me ask you this question, Hussein. Here you are, you're in Egypt, whether you're secular or you're Islamic fundamentalist, you hate Jews, you hate Israel, you believe Jews want to take over the world. So what happened to you where you had a change, a metamorphosis, where you stopped believing this, you didn't want to kill Jews, and in fact, you were imprisoned by the Egyptian regime. They thought you were a spy for Israel. How'd you go from an aspiring Judas to where they thought you were a spy for Israel?
Well, it went through that obsession. It started from that obsession. As I said, so I was coming to age, early teenage years during all of these complications of, the post 9/11 world, the second Intifada, all of this, and I really got into this obsession that Jews really are the cause of all the problems in the world, and they wanted to do something about it. And because I have a nerd personality, I thought the best thing to start is with studying those people, understanding how they think, and so on and so forth. And back then, high-speed internet had just entered Egypt, so I decided to go online and teach myself Hebrew, and that way, kind of, the dark language.
You want to know your enemy.
Exactly, yeah. So I'm gonna go learn Hebrew, the dark language of Mordor, and through it, I'll find out, what are they up to. And I went online, and I was motivated by this, hatred and obsession. And I actually managed to teach myself, English and Hebrew online in a matter of a couple of years. I was able
In other
to.
words, you absorb the language of the big Satan and the little Satan.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, and I started, to examine the world, and back then the internet, the world of the internet was really beginning to explode. I mean, YouTube was, came around in 2007, and also internet in Arabic was not that developed that much. So most of what you could find is either in English, and there were a lot of Israeli sites. So I used to learn about Jews and about Israel. And of course, kind of slowly, there was nothing that I could say that there was like a euphoria moment, a button that clicked and kind of happened a whole transformation. The process was slow and residual, and it was painful. But I was slowly realizing that the world doesn't operate at all in the terms of the anti-Semitic fantasy, that Jewish history, with all that it contains of exile of the Jewish people, the different massacres that the Jewish people went through, the different catastrophes that the Jewish people went through, objectively is very, very different than the history of a people who control, the pace of human history itself, who dominate the economy, the politics, dominate the ideas of history. So I started slowly to realize and started to see how that Jewish history and Jewish people and the Jewish religion is very, very different than they appear in those anti-Semitic fantasies.
You're probably wondering, if the Jews own the world and control the banks and the financial institutions, why are they being killed?
Yeah, it couldn't be any different. I mean, you can't really reconcile what we know about Jewish history that was actually pretty awful till very recently, basically till the state of Israel, until the United States rose to the dominant position in the world that it rose to, which happened extremely recently. We're talking about after World War II, pretty much. But before that, you can't point at any moment in history and say, you see there the Jews controlled anything really in any meaningful scale. And that led me to a further examination of not just the Jewish people, but even my own religion of, Islam, and where these things came from and why do people think so. And slowly I became aware of the fact that I was swimming in an ocean of these anti-Semitic obsessions and pathologies that completely distorts people's sense of reality and completely falsifies people's experience. And it became such an all-encompassing ideology that a lot of people can't even imagine the world without it. I looked at the state of Israel and I was extremely shocked. And I think that there are a lot of things that shocked me about Israel, just how different of a society than I thought it was. But the one thing that I can say for sure that it made a huge difference is when I realized that the level of hatred that existed around me for Israel was not at all or even nearly reciprocated by the Israelis. That is, that you will not find in the Israeli media or Israeli education this level of hatred for Arabs at all. Even the most extreme Israeli voices that people would accuse of anti-Arab racism. Even their racism is never amounts to kind of the genocidal obsessions that anti-Semitism produces, and that made me realize that things are off, that things are not right, and that my sense of reality is completely distorted, and that was really painful, especially at a very young age. I was 17 at the time, pretty much, when I was going through all of that. And I had to go through a process of a deconstruction and reconstruction of my understanding of the world around me, and then my understanding of myself.
And at that time, did you or anybody else wonder why, if the Jews are so evil and Israel such a terrible country and it's Satan, why the Egyptian government is engaging in diplomatic relations? And I think Israel had a consulate, an embassy. Did anybody ever encourage it so bad? Like, what are they doing here?
Of course. So this was constantly used. This was constantly used by the opposition, by the political opposition to the regime, to point out how bad the state is. I mean, they have relationships with Israel. It was also used by Islamists in their propaganda against the regime. And when I say the opposition here, I want to mention something important, and you touched on this a couple of times, that actually a big part of the opposition, for example, a country like Egypt, they were a lot of, the Arab left has a very long history in the Middle East. I mean, the founding ideology of many of the modern Arab states was kind of this socialist Arab nationalism. So it was in the Arab left, a lot of them, and then you have liberals and you have very secular people. And they would actually use the relationship between Egypt and Israel in order to get at the regime. So here you have a mix of opportunism, ruthless political opportunism that plays with anti-Semitism in order to undermine the stability of the regime. And you have, at best, it is ambivalence to the pathology that is anti-Semitism by the secular people. I don't think it was ambivalence. I think a lot of secular people are anti-Semitic in many Arab societies, and sometimes even more than conservative and more religious people.
So here you are, you have this whole thing going around. So what happened? You said it wasn't any particular moment, but at some point, did you visit some Israeli institutions in Cairo? What happened?
That's actually how I started to come to contact with the government. So in 2009, I decided, I was 20, I turned 20, and I decided that I wanted to, by that time I had learned Hebrew, I knew Hebrew fluently. I knew a lot about Israel, I knew a lot about Jewish history and Jewish culture, and I became a fan of, Jewish, not just a fan, my obsession of Jews, my unhealthy obsession turned actually to a healthy curiosity. I started to learn about the world through learning about Israel and about Jews. So I decided that I wanted to visit, and as you said, Israel had representation in Egypt, primarily through the consulate in Alexandria, and at the time, the Israeli embassy in Cairo, and there's also an academic center attached to the Israeli embassy in Cairo. All of this now doesn't exist. There's only one representation now of Israel in Cairo. But back then, those things existed. So I decided to visit that academic center that was attached to the Israeli embassy. And upon my visit, I was stopped right after my visit, actually just coming out of the building. I was stopped by the Egyptian state security. In Arabic, it's known as Amn al-Dawla. It's kind of the Egyptian NSA, and basically that started opened a whole new world of in interrogations, detention, being suspected of being a Mossad agent, a Zionist spy, a Jewish convert. And there was a very terrible period, and brought me to a clash with my own family, because before that my family had no idea about what was going on with me. But now that the Egyptian state security agents came knocking on the door and even took my father for interrogation, my family discovered that I'm in trouble, and they confronted me, and I told them like my ideas and how strongly I feel now about actually defending the Jewish people and defending Israel, and trying to correct the terrible ideas that people around me have. That brought me to a major clash with the family, that the family ended up disowning me. And then in 2010, all of these problems with the government culminated to the longest period of detention and imprisonment by the Egyptian military intelligence for over 2 months, on the suspicion that I was a spy, that I was a Mossad agent.
And only because you visit an Israeli institution which existed in Cairo. So
Yeah,
that's what I find so puzzling. And didn't the fact that you had a brother who was an imam who was inspiring young people to become jihadists, didn't that help at all the situation for you?
My brother wasn't. He was still also on his path of radicalization, so he was just starting to become extremely religious back then. He didn't get so deep into it, but by that time. But my brother really didn't play. He himself was angry. He played a big role in pushing the family to disown me, because I became an apostate and all of these things. But the government itself, I mean, I'm sure, I don't know if you read the book, but you'll find a lot of details in the book. But I was shocked to see. Here I am. I was 20 years old. I don't know really much about the world or about life, except that those little things that I now manage to teach myself. And I was being interrogated by adult intelligence specialists and officers, and they were truly convinced with the anti-Semitic paranoia.
And they
That
did they torture you to try to get a
Yeah,
confession from you?
yeah, they did. And as I said, they were truly paranoid. I mean, the paranoia was real. Like, you must be a spy. Okay, why do you know Hebrew so well? Nobody in the country knows Hebrew this well. How did you learn it? Did the Israelis teach you Hebrew? And just a lot of paranoia. And it was truly a terrible time. I mean, thank God it ended after 2 months.
We're going to take let's see if we can squeeze in some calls. Let's go to Stan of Forest Hills, patiently waiting. Stan, your question for our guests.
Thank you. Just two quick questions. Sir, do you believe in a two-state solution? Hello?
Do I believe it? Yes. Do I believe in a two-state?
You believe in a two-state solution?
I believe in a two-state solution would be ideal, but I don't believe that it's at all possible at the moment.
Is that it?
So do you believe or you don't believe?
He said he does believe, but doesn't think it's possible at this point in time.
Okay, the other question is this. Israel now has Jerusalem as its supposed capital.
What do you believe that
it should have been moved?
What do you mean supposed?
Well,
it is its capital.
They moved it.
It is the capital.
It is the capital.
Do you approve of that, or would you rather see it back at Tel Aviv?
You're talking about the embassy.
Are you talking about the U.S. Embassy? No. I like Jerusalem being the capital of Israel, and they think the U.S. Embassy in Israel should be in the capital of Israel.
Okay, those are my main questions. Just wanted to get some view on how you think now, and that's it. Thank you.
And thank you for your phone call. So, how long were you tortured? What kind of torture did they subject you to, and how long did it take before you were able to get out?
It was a little over 2 months, and it was just a lot of beating, kind of with a special kind of sadism. And as you know, these countries are not known to be bastions of human rights, or to to unfortunately, a lot of these governments don't respect human dignity. So it was mostly beatings.
And at what point in time did it stop, and how did you get out?
They just, I guess, they figured out after 2 months that I'm not a spy.
Oh, they actually believed you that you weren't a spy.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So they
Thank
let
God.
you out, and what happened? Were you able to go back to your family because they disowned you?
I didn't go back to my family. I stayed with some friends, but that was right before the Arab Spring. So the Arab Spring broke out exactly a month after I was released. In the Arab Spring, a lot of things changed. As you know, Hosni Mubarak himself left, and the Egyptian state was a state in flux for a while. So I participated in the Arab Spring like a lot of young people, but I was disillusioned pretty quickly when I saw how the squares were started to be filled with people who looked visibly that they belonged to Islamist movements. And then I decided I should leave, and I left, and I came to the United States.
Before we break, do you still have any contact? Did you have any contact with your family?
Yes, we reconstructed a lot of the bridges recently, so I speak now regularly with my parents.
And how do they feel about the fact that you love Israel, you love Jews, you have a different perspective from what you grew up?
They came to accept it. They came to accept that they don't understand it, and actually the Abraham Accords, uh, funny enough, helped me a lot in my own personal life. In that regard, because when they saw that they're now major Arab governments are doing what I said when I was like a teenager, when I was what I was thinking about, they understood that I'm not crazy, I'm not an awful evil person. They understood that I just have a different opinion, and that they don't understand.
How many people are in Egypt?
Over 100 million.
And are you telling me that you're the one and only 100 million? Is there anybody else like you that you know about in Egypt that grew up hating Jews and then discovered, hey, maybe I'm being fed lies? And
no, there definitely are people, and there are more now. Actually, I would say the floodgates are open. There are now more people every day. There's a major transformation, and this is a good chance for me to talk about this, Zev. There's a huge transformation that are happening in many Arab societies that are absolutely not reported in the American media, uh, because certain obsessions of our mainstream media outlets and a complete lack of touch with reality, where when Arabs talk about peace or normalization, now if there's an American in the room, the first thing they say is, "What about the Palestinians?" So ironically, with an ironic twist of fate, I now find more Arabs who are more willing to try to understand what I'm trying to say than a lot of Americans who, like, the first thing is scream with indignation, "How about the Palestinians?"
So it's more of an American thing than what's happening in the Arab world. The Arab world is not paying as much attention to
The Arab world after the destruction of the Arab Spring. I mean, thank God that I left Egypt the time that I left Egypt. I basically jumped ship. You remember what happened after 2011? You had the rise of Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. You had ISIS in Syria. You remember the image that we saw coming out of Syria, waves of refugees escaping to Europe. There's so much pain and destruction that the region had experienced in this last decade, and that finally got, not everybody, but the smart people and the people who have a will to think, got them thinking. And a lot of people are tired of the Palestinian cause. It's not even on the first 5 problems in their list of priorities. They understand that the region has huge problems, way more the problem between the Palestinians and the Israelis, whether the civil war, whether the civil wars, the terrorism, the radicalism, the complete instability, the political fragility, the lack of opportunity for a lot of young people. How the region, there was actually a policymaker from the region that talked to me recently, which is also unthinkable, that I was, as I said, I started my career in Egyptian prisons, and now there are actually decision makers coming in the region. And he was lamenting on the fact that the Middle East became the world's largest exporters of refugees, and how this should be shameful to all of us, and this should not be acceptable. So people are thinking.
Well, I hope so. Hussein, Abou Bakr Mansour is our guest, the director of Emmett's program for emerging democratic voices from the Middle East. He grew up and he was born in Cairo. He wanted to become a jihadist. He wanted to kill Jews. Now he's helping Jews. You're listening to us here on the Talkline Network from Israel.
Listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. Our guest is Hussein Abou Bakr Mansour, director of Emmett's program for emerging democratic voices from the Middle East, but he wasn't always sympathetic to Jews. He grew up in Cairo wanting to kill Jews, wanted to be a jihadist. Today, he's working with Jews. He received political asylum in the United States under President Barack Obama, 2012. You can catch his writings in a variety of different publications, including Mosaic, Times of Israel. His autobiography is called Minority of One, the Chaining of the Arab Mind. Do you think the Arab mind is really changed or changing in a significant way? You can point to pockets of people, but is it really completely different from when it was when you were growing up?
No, of course not. A change at this scale is going to take time. But what I wanted to say is that change is actually starting. It has started already. And I'm sure that a lot of people have been talking about this for a long time. Your audience, those who are older and remember the long history between Israel and the Arabs, know that people talked about how the Middle East needs a change and Arabs need to change for a very long time. That almost became a cliche. What I want to say, it actually has started. It started in very important pockets, and it's not just a few people. It's actually people who have power and wealth of some of the most important nations in the region. But as I said, this is going to be it's going to be painful. It's going to take a long time, but it has already started. It's an elite-led change. It's not from the bottom up. It's not from people who are being democratic and taking their destiny. It's actually the opposite of that. It's a few elites who realized that there are major historical mistakes that have been made, and they are responsible. And I personally believe that this level of anti-Semitism is responsible for a lot of the destruction that happened in the region. And it's a time to change course. So the channels to change it open. The Abraham Accords is a huge step towards that. Huge. It's just hard for me to explain to people how important is the Abraham Accords. Within 2 years, the United Arab Emirates made major steps in normalization with Israel, significantly more what Egypt has done in 40 years. They are serious about this. They are serious about the change, and they are serious about being the leader of that change in the region at large.
Have you visited Israel?
Of course, yes, multiple times, and I can't wait to go back.
Now, how did you get involved with Emmett? And tell us our audience what Emmett is all about.
So Emmett, the Endowment for Middle East Truth, is a small policy shop and think tank in Washington, D.C. That is dedicated to its name, which is Emmett, to educate policymakers and the members of the U.S. Congress on the Middle East, on Israel, and what's going on in the Middle East, with honest truth that captures the reality on the ground of the challenges that the state of Israel is facing. It's very pro-Israel, very pro the United States, unapologetically. We basically we educate policymakers. That's basically what we do. We're on Capitol Hill every day talking about the issues, and of course the most important issue that we talk about right now is Iran and the existential threat nuclear Iran would pose to the state of Israel, making every effort possible to prevent a disastrous nuclear deal with Iran that would only empower such a terrorist state. So I got with Emmett. Actually, a mutual friend introduced me to Emmett's founder and director, Sarah Stern, and we found that we both have the same mission. She's very passionate and dedicated to supporting Israel and the Jewish people. and I am as well. And I decided to work for her.
No, it's just amazing that you were able to do that, and you're able to transform your life. Did you, now you grew up, you were into the Islam religion, you bought everything that you were taught. Has
Yeah.
your religious commitment changed because of what you discovered, the lies that you and 100 million
Yeah.
were taught?
Yeah. Of course, this. Um, Naturally, when you go through a shock like that, you deconstruct everything you thought you knew, and it's a great shock. So you basically threw out and reveal and everything. And I did that for uh, I did that for sure. I completely wanted no relation whatsoever with not just Islam but religion. Period. But I think in the last few years, I was able to kind of reopen my mind and heart in general, and rediscover that religion is not meant to be the nightmare that unfortunately a lot of people can make it to be. And Islam has many problems as a religion, has many structural problems, has very problematic traditions and problematic texts. But I do not think it's irredeemable. It's a major religion. It's almost 1.5 billion people in the world, and I think it's just redeemable. It just needs to be saved through meaningful and sincere and honest reforms that address many of its problems that leads to so much radicalization around the world. I mean, we just heard, unfortunately, about a terrorist attack in Jerusalem. The author Salman Rushdie was just stabbed in New York, I think, on Friday. And these level of crimes are repeated crimes, and this shows how that there in the Muslim world there are serious problems that need to be addressed. So today I'm much more open to listen and to talk about a potential of Muslims making a better Islam or creating a better Islam for their communities and for the relationship with the world, which, as I said, I think is already happening in several countries. Even Saudi Arabia, that once used to be a bastion of Islamic ultra-conservatism and supported so much radicalization financially and logistically, even Saudi Arabia officially is making major changes to its policies domestically, to its textbooks, the ways they educate their children. And I think those are all very, very hopeful signs.
So let me answer this question. Did you ever consider converting to Judaism? You studied Hebrew, you studied the Jewish people, the history.
I love Judaism. Did I consider converting to Judaism? No, because I never felt that I need to be a Jew in order to do what I want to do, in order to understand and love the Jewish people and support them and support Israel. But I have to say that I learned a lot. I have a great debt, and I'll have it forever, to Judaism, the way that it taught me very different things and enabled me to build a much better idea about the world and about myself. And I'm still a student of Jewish wisdom.
Now, you mentioned, we spoke earlier about the fact you had a brother who became an imam, inspiring young people to become jihadists. Did you have a rapprochement with him? Is he still teaching that hatred to young people in Egypt?
I have no contact whatsoever with him, so I don't know. But he doesn't. I know that he doesn't live in Egypt anymore. He lives in Saudi Arabia.
And is he still teaching jihad to young?
I wouldn't imagine that he's able to do that in Saudi Arabia now that they have a new crown prince who is cracking down hard on all forms of radical Islamism or radical Islam.
Are you able to visit Egypt these days?
I would not risk it.
Because you'd be afraid they could arrest you if you went to Egypt.
Yes. Despite that I'm a U.S. citizen, I would not want to take the risk.
And what about other Arab countries?
No, I do visit other Arab countries. I visited Morocco. I visited the UAE. I visited a few other Arab countries, and I even got some in a few countries. I got an official welcoming, and again, that just shows you the actual change that is happening in some of these countries. So it's it's getting a little late for me. So maybe I'll close on with this note, that I want your audience who listen to my story, I'm being very honest about the problems of anti-Semitism and just and the obsession, the unhealthy obsession with Jews in many Arab and Muslim countries that led and leads to a lot of terrorism and the loss of Jewish lives, including the story that we're now in Jerusalem. But I don't want your audience to take that as a a condemnation with some sort of a finality that those people are irredeemable. These societies can change. There is hope for change. I hope that I show this hope. I hope that the Abraham Accords show this hope. So this is not just the ultimate end of Muslim-Jewish relations.
Before I let you go, final question though is that we saw what you mentioned what happened to Rushdie. He was stabbed by an Islamic fundamentalist. Have you had any threats against you for advocating a different position vis-a-vis Israel from Islamic fundamentalists, whether it's here in this country or any country, including?
I do have online. I receive online threats. But I do take security precautions. People don't know where I live, and so I do feel safe in general.
I want to thank you, Hussein Abou Bakr Mansour, director of Emmett's program for emerging democratic voices from the Middle East. Born in Cairo, he wanted to be a jihadist. He wanted to kill Jews. He saw the light. He studied Hebrew, English, and he was tortured in Egyptian prison they thought he was a spy for Israel. He received political asylum in the U.S. from President Barack Obama in 2012. He's currently the director of Emmett's program for emerging democratic voices in the Middle East. He's worked for other groups as well, and his book is called Minority of One. Hussein Abou Bakr Mansour, thank you for your conviction. Thank you for standing up for you. Thank you for what you're doing. It's not just for Jews. It's for all of us to get the truth out. That's what Emmett stands for, truth. And thank you for your advocation and for your being so strong, and we appreciate it. May God continue the strength to continue.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And thank you. Thank you for joining us here on the Talkline.